Richard and Amanda Holloway thought they had found the perfect Long Island home to renovate, but within weeks of moving in, their dream turned into a nightmare when they uncovered a hidden box in the basement, one that would unravel the chilling secrets of the Brantley family who lived there decades earlier, and expose a story of disappearances, obsession, and a son who may have been far more dangerous than anyone ever realized. Richard and Amanda Holloway had always dreamed of owning a house on Long Island, a place where they could put down roots and raise their daughter, Ella. When they first drove down the tree-lined streets of Suffolk County and saw the old two-story colonial, something about it felt right. The house wasn't perfect. Its shutters were falling off, the roof sagged in places, and ivy had crept across much of the front wall. But Amanda saw potential. It had the kind of charm that newer homes didn't have. Richard, who worked as a carpenter and handyman, looked at it as a project that could keep him busy for years. What they didn't see, what they couldn't imagine at that time, was that the house carried a story no one in the neighborhood wanted to talk about. The real estate agent mentioned that the home had been empty for years, ever since its last owner passed away. She was careful with her words, glossing over the details. But Richard noticed the way she avoided eye contact when Amanda asked why the property had been left vacant for so long. The neighbors, too, seemed unusually reserved whenever the Holloways introduced themselves. They were friendly enough, polite even, but there was something missing. No one seemed eager to welcome them. No one offered stories about the previous families that had lived there. It was as if a curtain had been drawn over the house's past, one that nobody wanted to pull back. On the day they moved in, Richard stood at the edge of the overgrown backyard, looking at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. It was quiet. Almost too quiet for a neighborhood where children rode bikes and dogs barked in distant yards. Amanda busied herself cleaning the inside, scrubbing layers of dust off the counters, sweeping cobwebs from the corners, and trying to make the place feel like home. She kept saying how beautiful it would be once they painted the walls and fixed the floors, but Richard felt something different, something he couldn't explain. The house was old, yes, but it wasn't just age that made it heavy. There was a weight in the air, as if time itself had stopped inside these walls. Still, the Holloways were determined. They laughed at the quirks of their new home, joked about the creaks in the floorboards, and ignored the uneasy glances from neighbors. For them, this was a fresh start. Richard immediately began tearing down decaying wallpaper, removing rotten beams, and sketching plans for a new kitchen. Amanda envisioned a bright and airy dining room where family gatherings could take place. Every nail hammered, every plank removed, felt like progress. They told themselves they were breathing life back into a place that had been forgotten. But late at night, when the tools were put away and the house grew silent, Amanda sometimes caught herself listening too closely. The house seemed to settle in ways that were different from other homes she had known. The cracks and groans of the structure weren't just background noise. They felt deliberate, like whispers traveling through the walls. She pushed the thoughts aside, telling herself it was only her imagination. Richard, too, noticed odd details as he worked. Certain sections of the house seemed strangely patched, walls layered over in ways that didn't match the original design. He chalked it up to lazy renovations from past owners, but the thought lingered in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. By the end of their first week, the Holloways had convinced themselves they were building something special. They had no way of knowing that the house itself had other plans. What began as a project to restore a home would soon turn into a journey that unearthed secrets buried deeper than any of them could have imagined, secrets that had been waiting for someone bold enough or foolish enough to uncover them. Richard had spent most of the morning in the basement, pulling away old insulation and knocking down sections of drywall. The air was damp and heavy, the kind of smell that only comes from wood left to rot for too many years. He was used to that. Houses like this often held layers of forgotten work, patch jobs done by hands that cared more about covering up than repairing. But this time, something felt different. His hammer struck against the wall with a dull thud, and then, unexpectedly, it hit something that didn't sound like wood or plaster. It was sharper, hollow, as if he had just tapped a pipe or a metal plate. He paused, listening to the echo reverberate through the basement, then struck again. The sound came back the same way, unnatural. Curiosity got the better of him. Dust clouded the air as he worked, and soon his gloves brushed against cold iron. Embedded between the studs was a rusted steel box, wedged deep enough that it had clearly been hidden there deliberately. It wasn't the kind of thing you stumbled upon in old homes. Someone had gone to great lengths to place it exactly where it couldn't be seen. Amanda came down the stairs when she heard the noise. She wiped her hands on a towel and leaned against the doorframe, frowning at the dirt covering Richard's shirt. When he stepped aside, she saw the box. It was coated with grime, but the outline was unmistakable. A strong, heavy container, sealed with a latch that had long since corroded. Her first thought was that it might hold valuables, maybe coins or bonds left behind. She almost smiled at the idea, but Richard didn't share her excitement. Something about the way it was hidden, in a spot that no casual builder would ever think to use, unsettled him. Still, they carried it upstairs and set it on the kitchen table. It left behind a trail of rust flakes and dust that scattered like dark sand. Amanda tugged at the latch, but it wouldn't budge. Richard pried at it with a screwdriver until the old metal gave way with a snap. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents. There were no coins, no cash, no heirlooms. Instead, the box held stacks of old black and white photographs, a leather-bound journal, and several bundles of yellowed newspaper clippings tied together with string. The photographs showed people they didn't recognize. Some appeared posed and smiling, others looked candid, almost intrusive, as though they had been taken from a distance without the subjects knowing. Amanda reached for the journal first. Its cover was cracked, the pages brittle with age. The name written inside was Eleanor Brantley, though every entry signed off with Nora. The handwriting started neat, then grew uneven, and rushed as the entries went on. At first, the writing described daily life, house repairs, neighborhood gossip, small frustrations. But then, the tone shifted. She wrote about being watched, about strangers standing at the edge of the yard, about the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom window at night. Richard thumbed through the newspaper clippings. They were reports of missing women, all from the same area, all within a few years of one another. Headlines blurred together. Local teen disappears on way home. Search called off after weeks without leads. Community grieves after third woman goes missing. Each article was marked with notes in the margins, scrawled in the same hurried handwriting from the journal. Words like, too close, same pattern, and the watcher, repeated again and again. Amanda's voice grew quieter as she read further. One entry described finding footprints near the basement steps. Another mentioned letters left in the mailbox with no return address. The final entries ended abruptly, pages smudged as if written in haste, and the last dated note carried only one sentence. He knows I've been keeping track. They both sat in silence, staring at the box as though it had released something far heavier than paper and ink. What they had uncovered was not treasure. It was a secret, deliberately buried in the bones of the house, a secret that carried with it a sense of dread neither of them could shake. For the first time since moving in, the Holloways began to wonder if their dream home was hiding something much darker than they could have ever prepared for. Richard and Amanda couldn't shake the unease after discovering the box. Days passed, but the journal and clippings never left the kitchen counter. Each time Amanda walked by, she found herself drawn to it, reading another page or staring at the faces in the old photographs. Richard tried to bury himself in renovation work, telling himself the past wasn't their concern, but even he couldn't resist piecing together the story. They wanted to know who Eleanor Brantley was, why she had hidden her journal, and what connection she might have had to the missing women in the clippings. Amanda began searching property records at the local courthouse, where old files sat untouched in dust-covered cabinets. She learned that the Brantleys bought the house in 1972. The owners were Thomas Brantley, his wife Eleanor, who sometimes signed her name as Nora, and their teenage son, Henry. The records showed they had lived in the home for just 6 years before abruptly selling it in late 1978. The timing matched the sudden end of the journal entries. It was as though the family had simply vanished. She asked around the neighborhood, but the responses were guarded. An elderly woman who had lived on the street for decades hesitated before admitting she remembered the Brantleys. They were polite, she said, but private, never socializing or attending community events. She recalled Eleanor walking their son to school, even when he was nearly grown, her face tense, as though she feared letting him out of her sight. The woman wouldn't say much more, only lowering her voice to warn Amanda that strange things happened back then, and that people stopped asking questions for their own peace of mind. Back at home, Amanda dove deeper into the journal. Eleanor wrote about finding cigarette butts beneath her son's window, even though no one in the family smoked. She described hearing the sound of breathing outside her bedroom door at night. She often mentioned Henry's withdrawn nature, how he rarely spoke, how he seemed to disappear for hours without explanation, how he collected old cameras and kept rolls of film hidden in his room. The entries began to overlap with the newspaper clippings. On the day one local girl went missing, Eleanor wrote that Henry had come home late, smelling of dirt and sweat. Another entry described how she found muddy shoes tucked beneath the stairs, shoes far too large for her husband, but not quite Henry's size either. She wondered in her writing if there was someone else in the house, someone she couldn't see. But as the entries continued, the suspicion narrowed until her words suggested a truth she didn't want to accept. One chilling passage noted that Henry had begun carving names into the underside of his desk, names that matched the girls from the missing persons articles. She wrote that she feared confronting him would only push him further, but keeping silent felt like complicity. Her final pages carried a frantic tone, almost like a confession, torn between a mother's instinct to protect her son and a woman's dread of what he might be capable of. Richard studied the photographs more carefully. Many were of ordinary moments: children at a park, women walking along sidewalks, groups of friends laughing together. But the angles were strange, often taken from behind trees or through fences. One image sent a chill through him. It showed the very backyard where he now stood every morning. The photo was decades old, but the swing set in the corner was unmistakable. Someone had been documenting the neighborhood from the shadows, watching and collecting pieces of lives that weren't theirs. The Brantleys' sudden departure from Long Island no longer seemed like coincidence. It looked more like escape. Whatever had been happening inside that house in the late 70s was not only real but dangerous. Eleanor's journal hadn't been left behind by accident. It had been hidden, sealed away, with the hope that one day someone might finally uncover the truth. Richard and Amanda had opened the box, but now they were left with the weight of a question that gnawed at them both. Had the Brantleys fled to protect themselves, or had they left to cover up something far worse? The basement had already become a place of unease for Richard, but after the discovery of the box, every step he took down the creaking stairs filled him with a new kind of dread. He couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's words, about her hints of secrets kept beneath the floorboards and whispers she thought she heard in the night. One evening, while Amanda was upstairs putting Ella to bed, Richard decided to push further into the shadows of the basement. He traced the walls with a flashlight, scanning for anything that seemed unusual. At first, it was all the same crumbling mortar, patches of mildew, warped beams, until the beam caught something that didn't fit. Near the far corner of the basement, one section of wall looked different. The paint was fresher than the rest, smoother, as if it had been sealed more carefully. When he knocked against it, the sound was hollow, not the solid thud of concrete he expected. He pressed harder, his hand running along a thin vertical seam where the plaster didn't quite line up with the floor. His stomach tightened. This wasn't just patchwork. This was deliberate. For days he told himself to leave it alone, but the thought gnawed at him until he couldn't resist. He brought down his tools and began chipping at the plaster. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the basement like a warning. Bits of white dust clung to his hair, and the hollow sound grew louder as the wall gave way. Finally, a large panel cracked apart, and behind it yawned a dark space. He lowered his flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow passage. The air that drifted out was stale and bitter, heavy with the weight of years. He crawled through, careful not to brush too hard against the jagged edges of the wall. The passage was tight, only wide enough for a person to slip sideways. At the end, he stepped into a hidden room no larger than a storage closet. His flashlight revealed a scene frozen in time. A cot leaned against the far wall, its mattress yellowed and collapsing into itself. Rusted cans were stacked in uneven piles, their labels long since faded. Cigarette butts lay scattered across the floor like discarded secrets. But it was the wall that stopped him cold. Etched deep into the concrete were names 5 in total, scratched unevenly, as if done in haste. Each name matched the women from the clippings Eleanor had collected. He ran his fingers over the letters, feeling the grooves carved decades earlier, and the reality of what this space had been settled over him. This wasn't a hiding spot. It was a chamber where someone had lived, someone who had stalked and watched, someone who had left their victims' names as a mark of possession. When Amanda entered the basement and saw what he had uncovered, her face drained of color. Together, they called the authorities, who sealed off the area and began a full excavation. Forensic teams worked methodically, peeling back layers of dirt from the floor. It didn't take long before they found what the Brantleys had tried to bury. Bones, fragile and broken, lay tangled in the soil. Jewelry still clung to one skeleton's wrist, and strands of hair, preserved by the cold earth, clung to the remains of another. The investigators confirmed what Richard and Amanda already feared: the hidden room had been used to imprison, to watch, and to conceal. The Brantleys' house was not just a place of eerie noises and old secrets. It was a crime scene that had lain silent for over 30 years. The investigation into the hidden room stretched for weeks, drawing reporters, detectives, and forensic experts to the Holloway home. What began as a quiet renovation had become a spectacle, with neighbors gathering on sidewalks, whispering to one another as police cars came and went. The discovery of the bones shook the community. For years, people had spoken in hushed tones about the Brantleys, but no one had ever imagined the extent of what had been concealed beneath their very feet. The house that Richard and Amanda hoped would be a fresh start had turned into the center of a decades-old mystery. Authorities pieced together the fragments left behind. The names carved into the basement wall matched missing women whose cases had gone cold in the late 1970s. The remains found beneath the dirt floor confirmed at least 2 identities through dental records, women who had vanished without trace during the years the Brantleys lived in the house. Their families, who had long since stopped expecting answers, were suddenly pulled back into grief as the truth of what had happened began to surface. Attention soon turned to Henry Brantley, the teenage son. Records painted a picture of a boy who had slipped through the cracks, quiet, withdrawn, prone to outbursts that were often dismissed as adolescence. Teachers remembered him as distracted, while neighbors recalled his strange habit of lurking near the edges of gatherings, staring at people but never speaking. The journal hinted at Eleanor's suspicions, her growing fear that her son was connected to the disappearances. Yet questions remained. If Eleanor knew, why hadn't she gone to the police? Why had the Brantleys fled so suddenly? Some theorized that she was torn between the duty of a mother and the terror of what Henry might do if she exposed him. Others suggested that both parents knew and helped cover for him, hiding evidence until they could quietly leave Long Island behind. The journal, with its abrupt ending, suggested Eleanor had reached a breaking point. But whether she chose silence to protect her family or was silenced by fear would never be fully known. What unsettled investigators most was that Henry Brantley was never located. The family's records ended with the sale of the house. No forwarding address, no death certificates, no paper trail. It was as though they had dissolved into thin air. Some whispered that the family changed their names and started over in another state. Others speculated Henry may have continued his crimes elsewhere, leaving a trail that was never connected. His absence turned the case from solved to chillingly incomplete, leaving open the possibility that the story was not truly over. For the Holloways, the home they had once loved became unbearable. Amanda couldn't walk past the basement door without shivering, and Richard stopped his renovations altogether. Within months, they sold the house, unwilling to raise their daughter in a place marked by so much darkness. Even after leaving, Amanda admitted she would sometimes wake at night, convinced she heard the sound of footsteps outside their window, a lingering echo of the horrors uncovered. The Long Island home had stood for decades as nothing more than an aging structure, its history forgotten by most. But when the walls were stripped and the foundations disturbed, the house revealed its truth. It wasn't just a building with creaking floors and peeling paint. It was a vessel of secrets, a silent witness to fear, obsession, and loss. And though the Brantleys vanished, the marks they left remained carved into concrete and memory, a reminder that some stories cannot stay buried forever.